Want to welcome you to another episode of Mindset Growth Podcast. My name is Gary Bontrager, your host. I have Ray Gage here with me today as my co-host, as you have seen before, I'm sure, and are familiar with some of his work. It's an honor to have you with me today again, Ray. And we have a unique conversation that we want to have that is, I believe, fundamentally a priority for everybody to go through. And as we get into this, the first thing I want to preface is there's a process that people go through, and I would not want anyone to feel guilty for being at a different stage of the process and not being able to feel like they've maybe accomplished what we're going to talk to with everyone in their life, because it's a process and things keep happening. And it's simply the word forgiveness. But I know in my life how that has changed me when I've been able to go through and forgive these four groups of people or these four people in my life. So the context of what we're going to talk about today is forgiveness. But I just don't want anyone listening to it to say that in order for me to have a quality life, I have to erase and forgive everybody immediately, because there's a process to go through that. There were people that took me 40 years to forgive for things that it went through, and it was process I needed to go through to be in a healthy place to make that happen. And so I don't think that it's just so easy as, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? That's not necessarily a healing process. In fact, it typically buries it and builds bitterness. And there needs to be a process that people go through where there's maybe conversation or no conversation sometimes, expressing where they're coming from and what they're going to tolerate and how they're going to accept the relationship. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. So it's not as simple as just saying, I forgive you. You know, when we were kids, our parents would make us tell a brother, a sister, I'm sorry, and it was for something minor, but it's not that simple most times.
Right.
So,
no, definitely not that simple most of the time.
But if we can go through and forgive these four groups of people, I believe that's what we need to do eventually to have the fullest level of peace and happiness.
So talk a little bit. So when I think about forgiveness, there's a lot of misconceptions around it. And I think that might be helpful to talk through a little bit before we get into the people that we think we should forgive, right? So, forgiveness is, like you said, we have the examples of when we're kids and, you got to say you're sorry, and then you ask somebody to forgive you. And I, for some reason, growing up, and I'm different, I know that, right? People tell me I'm strange. I say I prefer unique. You can say whatever you want. But it always bothered me that to ask somebody to forgive you, or somebody asking me to forgive them, for some reason it just never really sat well with me, and I didn't really understand it until I was quite a bit older, and I started to think about that, right? Because when you think about forgiveness really, who does forgiveness release?
You.
It releases you.
The person, right.
So if somebody is asking me to forgive them, they're not asking me to release me. They're asking me to release them.
Right.
I can't release them. Who can release them? They can.
They can.
So who do they need to be asking for forgiveness from in that instance? Not me.
So there's a second word that comes into play.
Which is?
An apology.
An apology.
And there's a difference.
There's a difference. So that's why I'm bringing this up.
Which leads us on to more conversation. So here's what happens. When we're young, we talk about that forgiveness. But if people don't come back, and I believe there's a form or a level of forgiveness that you can grant at some point to a person, even though they keep reoffending and doing the same things that are hurtful over and over and over. So there is a way to do that. But if you want to clear your mind, you need to go offer an apology, but you cannot necessarily demand forgiveness.
Right.
And you need to have a change behavior if you're doing that. And there are cases that can all be different. But it would be best to think in terms of, I'm going to go offer an apology for my behavior, and then let that person process and grant the forgiveness.
Exactly. So, and I often tell people, and actually I've coached clients with this before, is think of it like this: is forgiveness is for you. You're releasing you. That's a for you.
Right.
I'm sorry is for them.
Right.
Now, the hard thing a lot of people have with I'm sorry is that they associate that with, if I say I'm sorry, then I'm saying I'm guilty.
Right.
That's not what it means.
No.
I mean, you could just be sorry that someone is experiencing something that you can tell is very traumatic. Whether they feel like you caused it or not doesn't matter. You can be sorry about that situation for them and not have to accept responsibility for it, because I'm sorry is for them. I forgive is for me. So there's a whole nother conversation probably that you have to unwrap with that there. But when people are thinking about this subject, it's helpful to try to make those distinctions,
Right.
I think. So.
Another thing that happens is, if they come to you with an apology, in a lot of times you've already worked through the forgiveness side. So then you'll hear people make comments that, well, I've forgiven you a long time ago. Or they're caught off guard. They don't know what to say. So they're like, well, I forgive you, but they don't. And what I have learned to be beneficial for myself, to buy some time to process it, is I can tell them, well, thank you. It means you acknowledge their efforts, but it doesn't mean that I have to accept it just because you have finally got to a point in life that you're willing to stop being an asshole. So, if that's where you're at, a thank you, acknowledging the effort they put in, is probably very sufficient.
Right.
Because, maybe you have forgiven them, but it doesn't mean you're not going to have a lot of feelings and emotions come up when this person asks that, and it's probably not the correct time to talk through all those emotions and that hurt and that pain.
Right.
So there's a lot of levels like that. One thing I have learned in life, and I try to encourage people to do, is don't overcommit. Because often that can come back to creating problems, even in forgiveness.
Sure.
Because we were going to do something and we had good intentions to do it. Well, just like if you say, I forgive you, but you're not ready and you haven't processed through that yet, don't tell them you do, because it's now adding more pain, guilt, and frustration upon yourself. Because one thing people will tend to do, and we can use the word narcissist, it's pretty popular right now. But one thing people do, maybe people that are hurting, will keep hurting people. And if they know they're hurting you, they'll throw out there, well, I'm sorry, I'm just not good enough. Or I'm sorry, I'm just, it's only trying to beg for sympathy and throw yet another shot at you. Or they're going other lengths to try to manipulate and control. So there's a lot of things like that with situations that you got to figure out how to build buffers. And eventually you can work through the forgiveness stage, but it doesn't happen right away.
Right. So really, I present forgiveness as a superpower.
Okay.
So because it's really one superpower that every human being has.
Right.
We're all seeking freedom.
Right.
We all want freedom. Forgiveness is the key to
Right.
freedom for a lot of people.
Right.
And a lot of us hold forgiveness back because we don't understand that forgiveness that we're offering is for us.
Right.
It's not for the other people. But there's really probably, if you break it down, and you might be able to add to it, but there's probably about 4 groups of people.
Right.
Or 4 keys of forgiveness, right? So the first one of those would be you're looking at maybe like your parents, for example.
Exactly.
So talk about that group and what that looks like.
I think just about everybody can look at their parents in some form or fashion and have something at some point in stage they're going to need to, in best case scenarios, that they probably need to forgive their parents for. Worst case scenarios, they for sure have to figure out a way to forgive their parents at some point in their life. And it may mean it's not earned. It might mean that it's the parents have never tried, and at some point, sometimes there's situations that are just unhealthy. But that group is a group of people that is probably really close to us, and I'm just curious to know your thoughts because they're so close to us. It's really easy to have that hurt and pain there. And sometimes kids can hurt parents as well. I mean, it can go both ways, but it can be a reaction. What are some of your thoughts on that group?
Well, so the interesting thing about that is, to me, what's come to be easier for me to understand is, and I'm blessed, my parents are both still alive. Not everybody is in that situation. Right. That doesn't mean that there aren't situations that I need to forgive my parents for.
Well, but it makes the element easier because sometimes people lose their parents and it was a bad relationship and now they would like to talk it out. But the other side is sometimes people have their parents and they would like to talk it out.
And they can't.
And it's almost so either situation's difficult.
Right. And really that's kind of my situation somewhat, not entirely. However, the thing that I have to remember, and the thing I think that's helpful for all of us to remember, is that for the most part, as we go throughout our day, other people that we come in contact with are not looking for ways to piss us off.
Right.
Our parents are really no different, right? So our parents parented us how parenting was modeled to them.
Right.
And so they were really, they may have
most times there are some.
Well, they may have tried to do it a little differently because they didn't like it the way it was done, but they didn't have a point of reference other than the point of reference that they had.
Right.
So they're going to screw up. They're going to make mistakes. I'm a parent. I'm sure there's things that my kids would look back and say the same things about me that I could say about my parents.
Right.
So, because it's, again, we're back to perception, which we've talked about before. But in this case, I think that, they were, for the most part, regardless of how much it hurt you, for the most part, there's exceptions to every rule. I always have to say that. There's exceptions to every rule. I mean, parents do horrible things to children sometimes that are criminal and immoral.
I would throw I like that idea that you're throwing out, that there are exceptions to the rule. And I can talk about this a little bit because my parents and grandparents are all gone. But there are things that my mother did based off of her experience, I can now see, that were probably, well, I know they were hurtful because I experienced it. She did not experience that because her mother did not do that. But I think there were other situations in her life that created some of that situation and pain to her. And that's how I had learned to work through that process. The nice part would have been if she'd have understood that at some point of her life, but she never did. So there are scenarios. It's more than even just modeling the parental. Parents.
Right. It's not just
and
the
sometimes
parents.
they put themselves, and sometimes humans do this in general. We put ourselves in stupid situations with stupid choices. And so then it affects kids as well.
Because it's when we put ourselves in those situations, it's our past programming that determines what we do next.
Right.
And if there's a flaw in that past programming, we're going to do something stupid.
Right.
More often than not.
Right.
And that stupid thing that we do, the level of stupid might determine that something has to be forgiven later.
Or they even, in worst case scenarios, alter their thinking, with,
right?
Chemically and other ways.
But you can talk through that, like so you had to go through a process of forgiveness with your parents. What did that look like for you?
So I will do that, and then we'll move on because we got 3 others to hit on. The thing that helped me the most was to understand, that my mother was human. She was basing her reactions off of experiences that I didn't understand and probably even know because she was really closed about some of those. And for me, what I had realized is, from a human nature point of view, I had expectations of what I wanted to experience and receive from her as a parent. Because if we're going to grade, I probably had the best relationship out of anyone in my family with my father, and I lost him young. So now I'm looking to my mother, who was pretty slow to grant comfort at times to anyone and encouragement, and I'm trying to get her to fill that gap. And so the last 2 years of her life, my mantra was, I expect nothing. I will go see her because she's my mother. She gave me life. And I started to focus on the grateful things that she did do for me. And I would leave feeling better because if something by chance dropped that was positive, it was more than I expected. And so that's really a life lesson, is manage our expectations. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's sometimes an unfortunate, and it's very unfortunate when it comes to parental relationships, that you would need to manage an expectation. But in many cases, it needs to happen, because otherwise we're expecting something that they're just not going to deliver. And if we're going to continue to expect it, we're going to continue to feel this pain. And that's how I personally was able to work through that forgiveness process with her. And it became almost to where it was a joke, where I would laugh about it as I would leave.
Right. So
it shifted my focus too.
On
right. What I was looking for.
Right. So you started looking for something different. So let's go to the second group.
Yes.
So the second group we would probably, so we'll talk about who we would throw into this category, would be like important relationships that no longer exist.
Right.
So, or that we no longer have it in the way that they were before.
Right.
That could be an ex-partner, an ex-spouse, could be a best friend,
right.
Former best friend, but it was a relationship that had a deeper connection than just a casual connection.
Right.
That for whatever reason is gone.
Right.
So talk about that a little bit.
Sometimes when you're, the thing that comes to my mind is probably somebody who's experienced a dating relationship with a person for quite a few years, and then maybe it just broke down, or maybe a marriage, and there are kids involved and other things, and eventually some things broke down, some things happened that were just unacceptable to move forward in that relationship anymore. Really for the health of probably both people, but one in particular, oftentimes, or maybe the kids. So there are things around that that can be very hurtful, painful, and are very deep. My experience, again, it comes back to what you stated earlier, is simply by letting it go, even though that person continues to do what they can sometimes to continue to cause pain. If you can forgive it and let it go, it's again, I'm the one who's better now. And it helps people really probably move on, change their focus. But I would say if you talk to people that have been through those experiences, they usually don't find true happiness till they can let that other person go. And the bad part is that person often potentially will cross your paths because the relationship you had with them was to some, especially if it was an ex-spouse, but even sometimes there are people that have kids together and they never did end up marrying, what have you. There can just be tough relationships, and they can use the kids, they can use friends, they use multiple ways sometimes to cause pain and hurt. And as difficult as it is, it's very freeing. And it doesn't mean you're not going to feel that anguish sometimes, or certain things happen. It doesn't create a trigger, but once you've forgiven them, you can usually talk yourself through it pretty quickly.
Right. So the impact of the emotion changes.
Right.
Because what we probably should have threw this in earlier, but we talked about if forgiveness is for you.
Right.
Unforgiveness is also for you. So who gets helped when you forgive?
Right.
You do.
Right.
Who gets hurt when you don't?
You do. Right.
So we have to keep that in mind, because especially I see this happening, not that it doesn't happen with the parent relationship, but a lot more with this category, is the feeling of bitterness and resentment, and that feeling of bitterness and resentment then that stays with you because of your unwillingness to forgive actually then starts to impact other relationships that are important to you that you still have. So that's something to remember too, is that unwilling to forgive is also going to hurt you.
Right.
And then it will spill into other relationships as well.
The thing that's interesting, it often ends up consuming our thoughts. And I know for myself, I had to get back to a place where I would manage my thoughts. And I know I've talked about this on other podcasts and clips and speeches I've done. But for whatever trigger point, when I would exercise, it's like I'd get an adrenaline dump of all the anger and bitterness of everybody that screwed me over. But that's what unforgiveness can do too. And it's a process of learning how to shift that energy and how that energy. And so it took me a few years, but now that doesn't happen anymore. I have a different focus and process on how I go through that to manage that energy. And I think it's fair to understand, anyone listening to this, there's a process to go through to forgive someone. It doesn't happen very quickly in most cases.
No, because it's the accumulation of the hurt that you feel probably wasn't in an instant.
No. If it took 40 years to gain all that hurt, when you make that decision to try to unravel it, it may take 20 to completely offload it.
It shouldn't take 40 because now you're using intention.
Right.
So
but it will be a process.
But it's still going to be a process. So we want to move on to the third. So how would you define the third group? The third group would be more like casual type relationships, maybe a teacher or
I would think
like that,
there's probably teachers would fall in there. I think of business relationships. Maybe it's a banker who made a decision that didn't benefit you, and it could have been, another business person in the community you live in. It's just different interactions. It's probably a group of people you're not close to, and so you don't know them as well. So it's really easy to go out and spew hatred and be negative towards that person and let them live rent-free in your head.
It's like, did you hear what so-and-so did to me?
Right.
So that's really kind of like your gossip corner.
They don't take a lot of space, but they're taking space.
They're taking space that they don't need to be taking for the reason that you're giving them that space.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't know how much we need to go into that. That's a little bit different group, and it's a smaller group, but it's important because I think you hit the point exactly. It's the gossip. Mm-hmm. And I know it's something I had to deal with tremendously, is stop talking about it. And it's now, when I feel that I have a victory in that, it's because somebody will come up to me and say, hey, did you hear this and this? And I may have, and I may not have. And often I'm like, yeah, it's unfortunate. And you start to say something positive, it usually shuts it right down. Or, yeah, I knew they had some things they're dealing with. I don't really care to get involved. And you can usually shut it off before it gets very far. But it's the small spaces they're taking.
Right. Now this last group, the fourth one.
Probably the most important.
Probably the most important, but really it's a really, really small group.
It is. It's the smallest group.
It's the smallest group because there's only one in the group.
Right. And it's you. It's how we forgive ourselves. And I think when we look at that other three groups of people, the one piece that makes it really difficult is we try to forgive those other three groups of people. But the hardest part sometimes is we blame ourselves or think we deserve some of that treatment and punishment we received, those bad relationships, because of how we've behaved and how we've conducted ourselves. And it may be true, but likely it's not. It comes back to our perspectives and how we enjoy the feeling of bitterness and how for a minute it makes us feel good to think about how these people have wronged us and screwed us over. And ultimately, we've got to love ourselves. The first step to healing is absolutely falling in love with yourself. It sounds maybe a bit different because, in Scripture it talks about don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. But there's a big difference between arrogance and self-love.
Well, we're also told in the second commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Right.
So if I can't love my neighbor past my capacity to love myself,
Right.
I really need to start with myself.
I wrestled with that a lot because there were people that I know I didn't love as well as myself. Mm-hmm. And then there were others I probably loved more than myself. And it took a lot of years to get to peace with that because that's a tough
Figure
one.
that out. It is. But when it comes to forgiving yourself, the things that we beat ourselves up over are things that happened yesterday.
Should be.
Well, for the most part.
But a lot of times it'll reference back.
What I'm saying is, I'm saying yesterday, meaning in the past.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Thanks for that.
Right.
Clarification.
They're all things that happened in the past. Well, where's the past?
Right.
It's gone.
Right.
Who remembers the past the same way that you do? Nobody.
Yeah.
So you're beating yourself up over the way that you remember everything that's happened to you in your past, and you're the only one who remembers the way that those things happened to you in your past. So who's the only one that can forgive you for those things?
It's only
you
me.
Are.
Right.
It's only you.
Right.
And just like, how many times, if you think about it, because most people aren't if you go back to group number 3, this is a good example, right? So group number 3, I mean, the banker who made the decision that he made that affected you negatively wasn't trying to be a jerk. He was just doing his job in most cases.
Sometimes they are.
Sometimes they are, but in most cases they're
politics,
just trying to do
but
their
that's
job.
life. There's politics.
But they're just trying to do their job, right? So like I said, most people aren't walking around thinking to themselves, who can I tick off today? So
the third group is probably the group that is mostly unaware that even upset you.
They even upset you.
Or offended you, I should say.
Right. But the thing is that the point that I'm making with that is that a lot of times the people that you feel like you need to forgive for you don't even have a clue that you're upset with them or that they did something to make you feel the hurt that you're feeling, because there was zero intention on their part to do that. So just remembering that too. And then let's go back to, I want to circle back to the parents too again, right? Can I forgive my parents if they're no longer here?
I would say you can.
I would agree. I just wanted to see if you had a different.
Because the forgiveness is for you.
Because it's for you.
Right.
The other person doesn't even, if I forgive somebody, the first thing that I'm going to do is not pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, guess what? I forgave you today.
Yeah.
So,
in fact, in the case that they're gone, depending on your beliefs, they've already given account for all of their actions, and it's nothing to us.
No.
What's for us is the forgiveness piece.
So I would say is, when I said at the beginning that, forgiveness is really a superpower.
Right.
Because forgiveness is the key to finding freedom.
Right.
Really, when it boils down to it, forgiveness is the key to finding freedom. Most of us are searching for freedom. Some of us would call it peace, peace.
Right.
So whatever term you use to describe that, it probably means the same thing. We want to feel peace, and peace is freedom. But forgiveness is the key to finding that.
It's the tool to get you to that point. The piece also to consider as you go through this is how it affects other relationships. There can be a lot of compartmentalization as you process through that. It doesn't, the one thing that I would, I want to talk about some of the guilts you feel as you process through trying to forgive people. I felt like hearing some of the things you even said, how it affects your other relationships, but it didn't affect all of them. It affected certain ones that maybe triggered me that were close to those experiences. Now, in general, all my relationships are better today because of that. But it doesn't mean I suck at all relationships. And I think sometimes people look at that, they're like, well, I just suck at this or I suck at that because I've experienced this. And you sometimes have to break it down and understand When we look at life, and I know often we talk about the files and the lenses we look through because of experiences we've had, I think there's ways you can have still good, meaningful relationships, but then there's healthy processes, and you should not expect to try to bypass that healthy process to get to where you have peace.
Right. But forgiveness could be the door
right.
that you walk through to take that path.
But there is a path to be able to walk through that door.
So most of us didn't come to the door today.
No.
We're at the door today, but it's an accumulation of experiences that we've had up to that point.
And we understand that there was a path we had to take to get to that door.
And when I open the door and I walk through the door, there's still another path, but that path isn't going to be nearly as long as the one that got me to the door.
Right.
And that, I think, is a key for people to remember, that once you've made the decision, and this is true for any change.
Right.
Once you've made the decision to change, the process of change is quicker than what got you to the point where you realized you needed to change.
And I like the key word you said, process. I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Mindset Growth Podcast. Remember, life is a process. It's about intentionality on setting your goals and trying to achieve those. And if complete peace and freedom and forgiveness is part of that, then consider that process on how to walk that path and be able to grant that for yourself. Understanding there's no right or wrong way because we all have different experiences. Thank you again, and drop a note in the comments letting us know what you thought of this episode. Share it with others that you feel that it would help as they're on that journey.